I am Bachelor Mayor Fargo and candidate for this county commission, District 2 countywide.
Hi, Jim Kennedy, City Council, District 2.
Michael Rhodes, City Council, Ward 4.
Any other official candidates?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm your Supervisor of Elections, Deborah Clark. Good morning, everybody. I'm Janet Long, Pinellas County Commissioner, District 1. That means countywide. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Bagley. I'm the Circuit Court Judge in Pasco, Pinellas County, 316. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Al Rosenthal, running for St. Petersburg Supreme Court in Fort Pinellas County, 2. Hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, all guests and visitors, welcome to Tiger Bay. Would you please stand? Thank you for attending. Guests and visitors. Guests and visitors. I want to remind members that
No, the power supply, nothing like that.
I'm trying to follow the script. Okay, Young Tigers.
Hello, I'm Jessica Silk. I am a student at St. Paul High School and I'm a junior. I am thinking about becoming a physical therapist when I graduate from high school, so I'm very excited to do this.
I'm Jessica Silk, and I am a school counselor at St. Paul High School. This is my third year at that school.
I want to remind members that the awards committee accepts nominations year-round in the Benjamin Franklin Distinguished Leadership Award, Thomas Paine Common Sense Award, and the Susan B. Anthony Grassroots Award. Criteria is found on the website.
Our program report, Wednesday, February 19th, please. Write down that date. February 19th. That's our annual night with Tigers. We have Daniel Ruth come in. Special price for Tiger Bay members. Please sign up now so we know how many you expect. Also, I want to encourage people to please look for the little black holes on your table and make a donation to the Marvel Picture Young Tiger Fund and excess contributions to that support the Yard to Walker Russell Democracy Scholarship for the Pinellas County Education Council. I don't have a black hole in my hand, but if I did, put money in it.
We're going to keep moving right along. Today's Tiger Tigers are board members Bob Fisher and Marshall Leonard. The rules for County Clerk question session are on your table. Please review them. As a reminder, only members of Young Tigers may ask questions. You have 45 seconds to frame your question. There will be no exceptions, and that's been reassured by the timers. You may only ask a single question. No speeches, please. Wait for the microphone and then state your name clearly so the waiters can get that down. Waiting, planning, call questions today are several board members. Vice President Pam Iorio, David Clement, raise your hand please. David Clement, Wendy Rassick, immediate past President Ann Drake McCullen, and Treasurer Linda Osmond. Gary?
Good afternoon, my name is Gary Mormino, I'm the moderator today. And first, a brief history of this program. How did Tale of Two Cities come about? In 2001, Ray Arsenault and I taught a class for the Board of Humanities Council, summer seminar at this title. It went so well, we thought we would do a program on this, which we did in 2002. We were fascinated how two cities separated by a bay of water could be so different. Whether it was the location of a new state university, the competition to secure the area's first television franchise, the race to bring professional baseball to Tampa Bay, the feuding between the Tampa Tribune and the St. Petersburg Times, Tampa and St. Petersburg, they're called like alley cats. Like St. Paul and Minneapolis, Oakland and San Francisco, Tampa and St. Petersburg thrive on creating conflict. And young ones, the high school students, asked Mr. Cash what the St. Petersburg Times was. Ray and I figured we owned the franchise for this idea, Tale of Two Cities. But as Frank Morsani discovered when he thought the Minnesota Twins were coming to Tampa, we surrendered to higher powers. So in 2003, the stars were in alignment. What if we replaced boring historians with dashing mayors? And thus, in 2003, we had the first Tale of Two Cities in St. Petersburg, and then in 2009, we did it in Central Soriano, Tampa. So this is the third time mayors Iorio and Baker have come together. And they're very gracious to come. Okay, the format for today's discussion is very simple. I'm going to ask the mayors 4 or 5 questions. They're going to respond, and after half an hour, we're going to throw it open to the audience for another 30 minutes. So the first question, how many chicken dinners have you all eaten with campaigning for that? That would be an interesting format for those words. Looking back at your city's respective history, what historical figures do you most admire? Mayor Iorio, whom do you most admire?
So we agreed that we were both going to stand next to one another while we did this.
Also, the tallest mayors in the histories of their respective cities.
Everyone in Tampa thinks I'm very short, and that's thanks to Mayor Rick Baker. Thank you very much. Rick and I used to have a lot of good times together. We went to a Simon and Garfunkel concert once. And who was the other one we went to? Crosby, Stills. And Billy Joel, I believe, we were both that the other day. So we're part of that crowd.
We were
almost arrested. Garfunkel had pot on him and he was trying to get the key to the city. These are the things you don't know until you're out of office. I'm really pleased to be here in St. Petersburg. And really pleased to be with my friend again. We had a lot of good times together. What was the question?
What historical figure do you most admire in the history of Tampa?
The mayor? What mayor here? Or the mayor. I'm going to talk about which mayor I really like. So Tampa has had a strong mayor form of government since 1949. But interestingly, since that time, it's only had 9 mayors. So for a long span of time, while it's been a strong executive form of government, until 1959, and then there was another mayor in between that served again for another 4 years in the early 60s. He was a great character. First Latin mayor, very old-fashioned, wore a hat, went around and gave cake to children all the time. But went home every day for lunch and brought people to his home for lunch, and his wife just miraculously would have a wonderful meal for 10, 15, 20 people. And then he would take a nap, and then he'd get up and go back to the office. But what was really interesting about Nick Lucio is while he was considered old-timey and kind of a relic of the past, he really moved Tampa forward in a lot of significant ways. That's when Tampa Stadium was built, when the airport was built, the interstate system was expanded. He was really quite a visionary and was responsible for a tremendous amount of growth in Tampa's history. When he was a county commissioner, he put his name on everything. It was kind of an era of big concrete. And he would stamp Nick Lucio on everything. So if you go around Tampa and you look down on sidewalks and bridges, you'll see Nick Lucio everywhere. And that was his imprint from his commission days. And there was a little thing that went up, or I went, stop. Good. All right, very good. I know the rules. You're the person to look at. All right, take it away.
Who's our favorite mayor? First, I want to welcome Pam Iorio to St. Pete. She was the last mayor in Tampa that wasn't trying to steal our baseball team. Very thankful to have her here, for her commitment to working together during this time. There have been a lot of great mayors over the years. I think of Ally and Robert Thomas, and recently Dave Fisher was a great mayor. I would say probably the one I admire is one that I know well, is Bob Owen. Bob served as mayor of St. Pete for 4 years, 10 years before I did. And he went through some very difficult times and advanced some very difficult things. The dome construction was started during his term, and they had to pay for all that. And he was actually approved before he took office, but he had to figure out how to pay for it, so he got that process moving. It was very, very controversial. Those of you that here know. He also was there during the Bay Plaza project. The Bay Plaza was before Baywalk. It was a project to assemble 9 blocks of downtown St. Pete and get that moving. And I think a lot of folks, in hindsight, talk about the failure of the Bay Plaza project, but my belief is that that was a catalyst because it assembled. We wound up building 2 parking garages downtown, and that's where Movie Code now sits, and that's where what are going to be the shops soon again sit, and that's where the Forensic is, and that's where St. Pete College is, and where Duke Power Company is, and all of that I don't think would have happened. And the reward he got was a recall election, a recall attempting to have him and the entire city council taken out of office. It's easy to talk about it in historical terms, but during the time it was a very, very difficult thing. And the courage that he showed to lead our city, I will always admire.
By the way, Mayor Iorio would like you to know that she used to love coming over to St. Petersburg as a child with her parents to go to early bird special. Which I thought was uncalled for. In your city's checkered history, who's your favorite road? And how do you explain why Florida in general and Tampa Bay in particular is a magnet for weirdness?
The latter part I can't answer. You're better equipped to answer that. I think it has something to do with the humidity. But the first part regarding Tampa's roguish history. Tampa has a fantastic history, and part of it is very colorful and illegal, and most of it had to do with how politics was really controlled by gambling interests for the 20th, most of the first half of the 20th century. In fact, most historians don't believe that there was an honest election conducted in the city of Tampa until the latter part of the 20th century. The highlight of this was the 1935 mayoral election between D.P. McKay and Mayor Robert E. Lee. was so, well, it was, ballot boxes were stuffed, poll workers were caught, hit over the head and knocked out. And so the National Guard had to be called in to restore order. And the day after the election, it was such a raucous affair that the New York Times had a headline talking about how heads were bashed in on election day and the ballot boxes were stuffed. And this was an absolute embarrassment to the city fathers who were trying to convey a different image of Tampa, but the image was one of just, a lot of outlaws and people running wild on election day. Charlie Ball was probably one of the most colorful characters in Tampa history. He controlled many votes between probably 1910 and 1940s. His influence waned in the 1950s. But he really, through the game of Bolita, controlled how public officials were bought off and elections were bought off and votes were purchased by he and his friends purchasing the money, the poll tax from individuals and then casting votes for literally thousands of individuals. Charlie Ball was an absolute character. Gary Mormino first taught me about him. He reached his end when he was mysteriously murdered in 1955 in Ybor City, and no one was ever arrested for it. While that time he was in his late 70s and way beyond his years of influence, but people believed that he was murdered to settle some old scores. But he was at the head of the whole gambling, Bolita, election influencing group that truly did put Tampa on the map in the most unfavorable way for the first half of the 20th century. It was a reputation that the city fathers could not erase until they really put an end to Bolita and the gambling, and until they really changed, Debbie, you'd be interested in this, that Tampa was the first city in the state of Florida to change from the paper ballot to the lever machine, so that the paper ballots could no longer be used to stuff the ballot box. So in 1937, Tampa actually moved to this new form of voting in order to stop the kinds of elections it had historically had.
I would have to say that I think the kind of the wildest time in St. Pete's history was my favorite time, was the 1920s. And St. Petersburg was always, from the very get-go, we were a city that was promoting itself as a tourist destination, as a great place to live. And the 20s was a great period of time. There were a number of characters. One of them was Noel Mitchell. Noel Mitchell was a self-professed sandman because he was selling sand as real estate all over the city. And he sat out in front of his real estate office one day, and somebody sat next to him, so he started selling lots in the city. We had subdivided the city into probably 8 times as many lots as you could ever sell for homes. But we were doing it so we could sell them for investments, kind of like timeshares for condos, right? So they were selling these lots like crazy. He sat down, somebody sat next to him, and he sold a lot. And a bench out in front of his office said, well, this is a good idea. So they started putting benches all over the downtown. Real estate offices everywhere had benches, and they were selling their lots all over the city. They called them the Knickerbocker Brothers. And so eventually, some were purple and some were yellow and some other colors. And finally, so Mayor Al Lang at the time decreed that all the benches had to be the same color, green. So that's how we got the green benches. Noel Mitchell in 1920 decided to run for mayor, and he was campaigning, and he decided that he had been put away for a little while before he ran. And so he decided, well, that might be a problem. And so he brought his, when he got let out, he brought his competency papers with him. And every time he went to a campaign event, he would wave his competency papers, and he would say, I'm the only candidate for mayor of St. Petersburg proven not to be crazy. And it was just 1920 St. Petersburg, and he was elected mayor under that campaign platform. And he lasted, I think, probably, Gary, 12, 14 months before he was recalled from office. He had a booze party. A booze party in City Hall during Prohibition. Okay, it wasn't during the dictatorship. He was recalled from office. He was followed by Frank Pulver. Frank Pulver was a fellow that had sold Wrigley the chewing gum, spearmint flavor, and the chewing gum machine. And so he had a lot of money, he got to St. Petersburg. He was called a millionaire bachelor mayor. And he got with a fellow named John Loudon, who was the city's publicist at the time. And they put together, I used less time the first time, so I can add it. And this is a story a little great, I promise you. It's hometown advantage there, so. John Loudon, the publicist, and Paul would get together all these great things. And one of them was they brought Mayor Paul went to New York, and during the winter, and he would march down Fifth Avenue with bathing beauties from St. Petersburg, and they'd stop traffic, and they'd take pictures, and talk about the Sunshine City and all that stuff. They would do events where they would have a technique where he would send kids out to bring tourists in, they'd take pictures of the tourists, they'd send newspaper articles to Milltown, Pennsylvania, saying, oh, John and Mary Smith enjoyed the beautiful Sunshine City, and he'd do dozens of these a day. And the final one, because I got to be was they decided to get together, and they were trying to, how do you get people together? So they formed an organization called the Purity. And they got a lady to be, I'll tell you, my next question, I'm going to finish the story before I answer this.
What forgotten heroes that historians have missed or that you've discovered that the audience probably doesn't know about? What forgotten heroes would you like to discuss?
When I went back to school when I was supervisor of elections to get my master's in history, and Dr. Mormino was helpful to me and steered me in the right direction so that I could pass and get my master's. But he also steered me in the civil rights movement direction so that I had an interest in that. And through that process, I learned about who I think are the really unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, and that are African American women who often are not written about in the history books, and yet were largely responsible for the grassroots movements that occurred throughout the cities, throughout the South, that really culminated in civil rights successes. In Tampa, in particular, there was a very strong group of women. Ellen P. Green, who was the first woman in 1959 to head up the NAACP. Mary Alice Dorset, who's still alive today, who started as a businesswoman in the 1950s and ended extremely successful and ended up registering thousands of African Americans to vote at a time when it was very difficult to have African Americans register. There was only one place to register. You had to go downtown to the supervisor of registration's office. You had to take off work. There was no weekend registration, no evening for people who worked. It was very difficult. Talking about the 1950s. Florine Jones, who was an organizer, just died this past year. These are African American women who you won't really find in history books. Just like the Montgomery bus boycott, really organized by African American women, but not often the people who you read about. They showed a lot of courage. They were unpopular. They fought against tremendous odds. They took real risks. There was a lot of violence associated even with voter registration. I saw that later as mayor when there were a lot of African American women who stood up to drug dealers in their neighborhoods. They'd walk right up to them and shake their finger in a drug dealer's face and say something to them. And I'd say, whoa, you know what you're doing here? Do you feel, because then you have to go back home and live next to the person you just shook their finger in his face and you called the police, let them know that you're the one calling the police. And they're just unafraid. And so I think those are the unsung heroes of the Tampa community. African American women who fought to become first-class citizens and won that battle. And then later, what I saw as mayor is African American women working hard and showing a lot of bravery to take back their neighborhoods.
So Frank Pulver, he got together with John Roderick, and this is, I'm going to get to these questions. And they decided that they wanted to bring tourists to St. Pete, so they created something called Purity. And what they did is they got a lady that was sufficiently grumpy to be chairman of Purity, and she was going to be like that. And she started writing letters to the editor. And she started writing letters about this terrible problem we have in St. Petersburg, and how she demands that we do something about it, and that we have too many beautiful women with very small swimsuits in the city. And she demanded that somebody do something about that. And so Mayor Pulver was upset about it, and this is a true story. So he decided, okay, well, we're going to do something. I'm going to appoint a bathing suit inspector for the city. And he searched the entire city for a bathing suit inspector, and he couldn't find an appropriate person to serve, so he appointed himself a bathing suit inspector. And then so then they had a picture that they took on the beach, at Spa Beach, with Mayor Pulver actually measuring the distance between the knee and the bathing suit of a lady, because he was the Purity League lady in the back, police chief sitting there looking down, and they sent that picture to cities around the Northeast and the Midwest. With this story about this terrible problem and fight going on the same period before over having too many beautiful women in the city. Thousands of people came to St. Petersburg. And we were overwhelmed, and we did a lot of crazy things. Unsung heroes, there are so many individuals that have contributed so much. But you almost have to put it into a category. In a category, I would honestly say the men and women that serve the police department. I think that is absolutely touched the city, and we honor the ones we lose, and we have to do that because great sacrifice that we make, and there are others every day that are going out there in some very difficult conditions and protecting our city. So I would say those are unsung heroes in my mind. And if I had to put a pinpoint on an individual, it'd be Reverend Chester James, who was a good friend of mine, baptizing with my kids, and was a leader in the civil rights movement. And he told me story after story about movie stand-ins, and lunch conversations, and all of the efforts that he did. He was a leader of that, and I love those things. Thank you.
Questions for individuals now, for Mayor Iorio. Voter suppression has been in the news lately. As the former supervisor of elections for Hillsborough County and the author of an award-winning article on the history of the white primary, what perspective could you provide on this?
Well, after 2000, everything changed, right, Debbie? Yeah. And elections became very litigious and under a microscope. You know, when I became supervisor of elections, people thought that I had joined the Federal Witness Protection Program. And that was until 2000, where then people actually began to care, well, who is the supervisor of elections and what kinds of decisions are being made? And then we moved to touchscreen, which really was a superior technology, and then we moved backwards to optical scan, which is paper ballots, which is a step backwards. It's very old 1980 technology. We're in the 21st century, but that's what we have. We're stuck with it. Voting has changed, and it needs to change. Just as it changed in the 1950s, when the only place you could register to vote was downtown. Well, now you can register to vote in many different ways. But one of the things that's clearly a success is early voting. And only in government would something that is so successful and that customers are lined up to use, would government say, this is such a success, we're going to stop and we're going to limit it. Okay? I mean, is there a company in the whole world that would do that? No one would do that. But for some reason, it was decided that because it was so successful, it should be limited. That's a huge mistake. If we had had early voting in 2000, the problems with the ballot designs across the state would have been discovered 2 weeks before Election Day. I can tell you the outcome of the election would have been different. Whether you wanted the outcome to be different is beside the point. It would have been different. An election won by 537 votes, 131,000 votes were invalidated because of an error was made, okay? So it's hard to reconcile that when you believe in our system of government. So early voting is good on so many fronts. Not only does it provide the greatest ability for the greatest number of voters with their different schedules to vote at their convenience, but it also allows election officials to see if there are any problems that might come up in ballot design, in anything. And that's important when you have everyone do something. You know, where it's really important is with the presidential election, when you have this tremendous voter turnout. It only happens once every 4 years. But when you have the kinds of lines, that's when you really need it. The other thing we really need to do in terms of reform is limit the length of the ballot. When you give a voter a 10-page ballot, as was done in certain parts of the state, with all the constitutional amendments, that's what you're asking for trouble when you hand someone an optical scan paper ballot, fill in the bubble, 10 pages. We've got to get into the 21st century with voting. We ought to be the leaders, and we're not.
A question to Mayor Baker. Mayor Baker, in all the news accounts chronicling the legacy of Congressman Bill Young, rarely did we learn about the legacy of Young's predecessor, Congressman Bill Kramer. Would you discuss how Kramer and others created the modern foundation of the Republican Party in St. Petersburg?
I think the Republican Party in Florida, post-Reconstruction, really got started during Hoover's election in 28. Hoover won Pinellas County, and a lot of Republican officials, the county officials and others, swept in to Pinellas County in that election. And I think Senator Welsh was elected. The first Republican elected to the Florida legislature since Reconstruction was elected from St. Petersburg in 1928. And then of course you had the Depression, and you had FDR, which kind of took over things for a while. And so back in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, Bill Kramer and a few others around the state started to get involved as Republicans in politics. And in the early 50s, he was elected to the State House. In 1955, he was elected to Congress. And he served in Congress for 15 years as aide. I believe Congressman Mills was his aide during that time. And of course, took his seat when he left office. He left in 1970 to run for U.S. Senate. There was an open Senate seat. It was a big election back then. Claude Kirk was governor at the time of Florida, and Kirk was running against Reuben Askew, and Kramer was running against this fella who came up with this idea of starting down south and walking the entire state of Florida until he got up to the Panhandle. And of course, we know a lot of Childs won that election, and Kramer was out. But Bill Kramer, Bill Young, and a fellow named Jack Insco, I think was his name, with an ICY, they call it the IC group back in Pinellas County. And really, Pinellas County was kind of the core of the Republican Party for the state of Florida, the birth of it at that time. And in terms of Kramer's contributions, he did a lot of things. The one I think is near to me is he really led the effort to get the interstate over here and get it through the city, which is why his name is on that interstate right now.
All right, should we begin with the audience? Okay. What is Tampa's greatest turning point in history? What event or series of events altered the city's history? That there's Tampa before and after.
Right, I think there were two. One we share with St. Petersburg, and that is the coming of the railroad. I mean, we both got the railroad in the 1880s, and it was a complete turning point for Tampa, because prior to that, Tampa's population had a hard time getting above 5,000. If you get above 5,000, then they're beat up. You know, smallpox, there'd be some other illness, people would be wiped out, it'd go down to 2,000, then it'd creep up again, then it'd be wiped out again. It wasn't until the railroad came, and that true with St. Pete too, that the railroad changed things, and that's when population really began to build. But a more modern turning point for Tampa was in 1975 when we were awarded the NFL franchise. That changed Tampa considerably to be just one of, there aren't that many NFL cities, and it just changed the civic feel to our city, that we felt that we had hit the big time, that we were an NFL city, and it had a lot of pride from that. And a lot of good comes from that too. Since then, we've hosted 4 Super Bowls. And because we successfully hosted 4 Super Bowls, we were awarded the Republican National Convention. And so, one good thing leads to another, but it really began, and I think a key turning point for us as in terms of our civic identity was the NFL franchise in 1975.
I'm thinking 3 things. One, the first, as Pam said, the railroad, Peter Benjamin bringing the railroad into town. I mean, I think all of Florida could be divided to before railroad and after railroad. And so that was critical in the late 19th century. That was critical for our growth. A second point I would say was World War II. And World War II, really, the city was overrun with training bases and tens of thousands of folks coming in. So we had the Army Air Corps base, which is now St. Pete Airport, and we had the Naval Air Base to teach people how to land on aircraft carriers, which was on Mormino Island. There's still a strip up there from that. And then we had the Coast Guard Air Base and the Coast Guard Sea Base and the Naval Sea Base at Naval. And then even out on the west side, we had folks that were camped out in tents, of military tents, thousands and thousands. We had a merchant marine base here. So all these bases brought in tens and tens of thousands of people through the city. And then after the war, a ton of them came back to live, to work, to retire. And a ton of those military folks resulted in us having military contractors and defense contractors in the city, which is why we've been for many, many years one of the great military manufacturing areas. And then the third point would be the interstate. I think without the interstate coming through in the 70s, we'd be a very different city than we are today.
I believe we're going to open it up for audience questions now.
Okay, he's going to have a question and answer from the audience, and you'll have 2 minutes to respond to the question and 45 seconds to frame the question, and no speeches. Pardon?
One caution. Again, the discussion is about the history, not why Rick Baker didn't run for Congress, etc. It's not the past. Not the past, not the present. Neil.
Okay, question for both. The exploits of Gibbons and Simmons and Germany in bringing US up to Tampa are pretty well known. But at the same time, St. Pete was looking to the legislature to bring the expanding campuses, university system, one to St. Pete. What's the story there? How did Tampa get a university and St. Pete didn't?
I thought St. Pete has university.
Or at least at that time.
Because it was so logical that it grew up in this world.
Okay, we'll follow up.
We were kind of the center of it all. Gosh, it hurts him sometimes. The words Tampa Bay have never left his lips. why, but I know that Gibbons was instrumental in it. There was a tract of land out there where no one lived. It was available for redevelopment, and it seemed like it was logical. I don't know why at the time St. Petersburg was bypassed. You might have some insight into that.
Yeah, the land in our city is valuable. So the legislature was looking for a large tract of land that they could get dirt cheap that nobody else wanted to pay. So they were successful as well, didn't it? So actually, the truth of the land's there, and I think it was probably 99% political, and there was probably just a little more muscle on the other side of it.
If you go back and read the newspapers, by the way, it's one of the great exchanges between the Times and the Tribune. The St. Petersburg Times called the new campus Brew U because of the Schlitz factory near there. And the Tribune said old people would be mowed down in the streets if the campus came to St. Petersburg.
Go back and do that. Tom, it's well documented that Tampa had organized crime. St. Peter did not, or does not. Tampa had a corrupt police department, at least part of the time. Organized crime had great influence over City Hall. So my question to Mayor Iorio, and maybe Mayor Baker has a thought on this, what cultural differences would account for organized crime thriving in Tampa and having such influence while they were shut out in St. Petersburg?
They thought St. Pete was too dull.
I love going to second.
You know, Tampa grew up very, very diverse with Italian, Spanish, Cuban population. And really, it was in the 1940s when the Italian influence with organized crime really took hold in Tampa. And so a lot of it is who came to Tampa. And we did have this wonderful, and we still do have this wonderful mix. And but part of that mix was organized crime. Now the good thing is we got all that out of our system in the 20th century, and that's good. But it does make for an interesting history. What did help Tampa grow from that and get rid of that stigma was that we had a strong mayor form of government earlier than St. Petersburg, which I do think the form of government helps. And Tampa has always held their mayors accountable, as people tend to hold their mayors accountable in a strong mayor form of government. And so from 1949 going forward, I think what you saw was really once the keep-offer hearings came to Tampa in the early 1950s, and the kibosh was put on organized crime, and the elections became more modern and finally honest. The advent of the strong mayor form of government really focused each mayor and administration on solid civic improvements that then changed the nature of the city and its kind of checkered past.
I'm not going to take the bait, but I will talk about the strong mayor form of government for a second. I think that I was on the Charter Review Commission back in the early 90s when we were trying to decide whether to go with the strong mayor form of government. And the balance between the two forms of government are the council manager form of government. You tend to have more professional government. You tend to have people that are hired that have been trained to do the jobs, and that are running government agencies, and that's a good thing. And there tends to be not as much patronage and giving jobs to friends and things like that. That was always a good thing for the council council manager form agreement. The bad thing was that it's not as responsive as a strong mayor form of government, because you have the council manager that as long as he or she can count to a majority on the city council, then they know they have a job, no matter how bad people on the community. Now, on the flip side, a strong mayor form of government can have the ability, strong mayor, I'm sure everybody knows, the mayor runs the administration of the city in addition to being a political leader. In the council manager form, the council picks the city manager and they run the city. So the strong mayor form tends to be, I think, it tends to be more accountable to the people, because the mayor has to be elected by the people and go around in the election process and go through that process to get there. But it can also, in the cities that have problems in America, and we can all name them, can result in the wrong people getting put in very senior positions and patronage going in and bargaining with union groups and things in order to get elected. And that can be the downside. What it does is, I believe the strong mayor form of government is the best form of government if you have a good mayor. And it makes the mayor's job very important.
Questions?
Bob Safransky. For both of you, which newspaper has been the most, how can I say, productive in moving this area forward? Is it the Tampa Bay Times, aka St. Pete Times, or the St. Petersburg Tribune or Tampa Tribune? Which paper has been the best in supporting and making our communities worth living in?
Yeah, we're right down. I think, let me just say, I think that if you're in elected office, you are always going to have a love-hate relationship with the media. That's just the reality of it. Because they're always going to be trying to find something bad. I mean, they do. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just what they do. And you're always trying, your objective is always to try to move the ball forward, because, and that you're hoping to have as little conflict in the process. And so the media, and not just newspapers, the media in general, is, one of their jobs is to try to find the conflict and create the conflict, because that sells papers and they have television ads and stuff like that. So that's kind of a natural part of the process. But, as much as I hate to admit it, I also think that one of the reasons that our city has had, I believe, a very ethical government for many, many decades is because of the aggressiveness of the media. And I think that, it's a hard thing to live with when you're the one with the bullseye on you, but I think it's a good thing for the media.
I think both newspapers have really played a role in shaping the Bay. The Tribune took on organized crime and took on gambling. And their publisher, really in the 1950s, 1960s, they made the point and did some really groundbreaking investigative reporting that helped clean up Tampa government. You look at this history of the St. Petersburg Times and their early leaders who, when you look at your beautiful waterfront today, isn't there a reason why it's called Straw Park? Am I right on that? Right? The history, because of really the articulation by the St. Petersburg Times of how the city should be planned and how the waterfront should be preserved and how there should be vision for this city. And even today you see that on the editorial pages of the Tampa Bay Times. And I think the Tampa Bay Times moving from the St. Petersburg Times to the Tampa Bay Times, well, it might get under the, will get on the nerves of some people, I don't know, maybe someone. I think they waited.
I'm trying to figure out what newspaper she's talking about.
Yeah, right. But that really reflects the 21st century and how we do view the Bay and the Tampa Bay area as one community, and that we don't view this bridge or the bridges as something that separates us, as a connector. These are connectors, not something that separates, and that we really are so much alike and that we complement one another as cities. And that's come from their editorial pages throughout the years. So both newspapers have really done their part, I think, in making us better communities.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm Jessica Silk, as I mentioned earlier. In quoting A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickinson, how far do you agree with the statement, "It was the best of times and it was the worst of times"? When it comes to the idea of instituting Common Core into our public schools, should we stick to the old ways in public education, or should we start thinking about the future?
I guess we're speaking in historical context. Okay, I'm going to speak in historical context. In historical context, in 1998, when Governor Bush was elected governor of Florida, the numbers for Florida from an education progress were not good. And Governor Bush instituted a concept which I think makes perfect sense. And that concept is we should measure the success of our schools based on the success of our students. That should be the primary measurement of a school. So if your school, and the only way I'm trying to get to, yeah, sure, thank you. The only way that you can tell whether a student is progressing the student is to test the student. Somebody turned it off as a test. So it's to test the student. So I don't know any other way to measure whether somebody's learning math or English or science. I don't know how to do that. So then the process of the A+ program Governor Bush put in place was to implement that within the school. Now I'm not going to debate is the perfect test being done, is it the right test, wrong test, but I will always believe in the concept that we measure the success of our schools by the success of our students, and we have to evaluate that success. Now, I don't profess to be an expert enough to know all the political machinations of Common Core and this and that, but I do believe having a solid testing program for students to measure the schools is good, and I also believe that it should be up to the state to decide that. And I think that it's a good thing if the states agree among themselves to use a test so we can measure how our students are stacking up against students in other states.
Well, I think the future of our country really depends on having a more robust educational system. And we should have high standards, and they're probably not high enough. When you compare our education to that is occurring across the world and who we're competing against, we don't stack up anymore. Whether it's Common Core or whether it's anything else, we should be setting very high standards for our students and insisting upon them and funding them, respecting teachers more and paying them more. We've got it all backwards in this country when it comes to education. We don't pay teachers enough, and yet we expect them to do the most important thing in the whole wide world, which is educate our young people so that they can live productive lives and have good paying jobs and compete with people from Germany and Japan and China and India. And that's not happening today. So our country really needs to completely focus on the highest standards. The fact that we even argue over something like Common Core shows you how far we've fallen. That we have to really even argue. That's not anything about history. But every once in a while the here and now is kind of fun.
Thank you both for being here. Speaking of history, last week, Mayor Baker, you made the statement that Senator Jeff Brandes was the best senator in the state of Florida. So speaking of our legislators in our cities, which legislator in the past or most contributions to your city?
Well, Jeff Brandis has to be the best senator in the state because he's from St. Petersburg. How can you expect anything else? I don't think there can be any doubt that Congressman Leonard has done more for this city, for this county, for this region, for the state, the country. From whether it's his support of our educational programs, whether it's support of our economic development programs, but beyond that, his support of the men and women who serve in the military, both while they are in the military and after they get out of the military. He has been, I believe personally that somebody should be elected from the community where they live. But beyond that, I think that once you get elected, you serve primarily the community you live in, but you serve the people around you as well. And I think that's what Congressman Young believed, and I think that's what he did, and I think he was a great legislator for us and our whole region.
So are you talking about the Florida legislature?
Yes.
Okay. So I am going to go back into history, for sure. So I really think that in the 70s, in maybe even the 60s, 70s, before we started with single-member districts in 1982, we had just some outstanding legislators in Hillsborough County, Terrell Sessoms and Dick Hodes, Lee Moffitt. I mean, we just had people who were quite visionary and understood that Florida, that you have to invest in your state to make it great. And my favorite is a person who was a mentor, who was not from this area. He actually represented Daytona Beach, and that's Fred Carl. He passed away last year. And as a legislator, he was very courageous and spoke out against segregation when it wasn't popular, and did a lot of things to work to modernize and provide a vision long-term for our state. And so I go back in history a little bit with people that I really respect and admire, because I think people showed a lot of courage and didn't care so much about re-election. And that's a good thing for the state when people don't care about that.
Hi, I'm Ray Neary. I'm a historical one. How in the world did a county as big as Hillsborough County only have like 3 cities? And how the smallest landmass of a county like Pinellas has 24 cities?
Right.
How did that happen?
I'm not sure how it happened. I'm from one of those cities. I actually grew up in Temple Terrace, which is a small city of 25,000. Then Plant City's the other city, about 25,000. And then there's the city of Tampa. And then the rest is unincorporated. And so Hillsborough County has this vast unincorporated. Most of the people in Hillsborough County live in the unincorporated part of the county. So you have about 700,000, by 650, who live in the unincorporated, in contrast to Pinellas, which is dominated by the small municipalities with a very small number in the unincorporated. And I don't know. What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's Pinellas County is a beautiful place to live, right? So when people came here, this was before you had interstates and major road systems. You know, when you were coming by train and you were coming by water, you know, or however else you got here, you didn't have any airports, communities started to form. And they really started, I believe this is very public word, but I believe they started out fairly isolated. Now, they're not completely isolated, but for instance, the group started up in Clearwater, because it's a beautiful place on the bay to start out, and it was not necessarily the same community. In fact, we were all part of Hillsborough County at the time, up until like 1912 or 1913. And so they were there, and then up in the north end, Tarpon Springs, that started the industries up there. So I just think it started out as, because you are on the water, you're surrounded by water, because you have access by the water, because it's a beautiful place, people started forming settlements. and they weren't connected until later. And I think, now, the politics of why they were all allowed to incorporate as cities, I think you could all question at this point.
Robert Capusta. For the benefit of 2020 hindsight, New York Times recently named St. Petersburg as one of the 50 places to visit. Part of that is because of the foresight of our forefathers putting together our park system. Looking back historically, this is for both of you, what action, decision, or what was done historically that you could go back and change, you would change to make the city better?
Absolutely, there is something, and this is where you have to give St. Pete and the people who designed it early on a lot of credit, and that is the waterfront. And Tampa was an industrial city, and at one time the waterfront, the downtown, here we have a river that runs right through the middle of our city, and it was filled with warehouses, right? So that was the old Tampa, industrial, little, no thought about how that waterfront ought to be preserved and opened up. Even as late as the 1970s, a big parking garage put on the waterfront, right? And big towers put on the waterfront in the 1980s. Now, we've tried to reverse that. We've tried to open it up. We've built the Tampa River Walk. The Curtis Dixon Waterfront Park was redone. Museums, the Tampa Bay History Center, the Glacier Children's Museum, the Tampa Museum of Art. Now our waterfront is something you can actually access. But that's relatively new. And so, people all the time will say, gosh, look at St. Pete's waterfront. That's because people really thought that through years and years, decades ago, and preserved that green space. And that's why you have such a beautiful downtown. It's walkable, and it's lovely. And, if I could have annexed it when I was mayor, I would have.
It was 52 cities, and there were only 8 in America, which is a pretty amazing thing. I have a hard time with it. It's not that we've been perfect as a city, but I'm not sure that there was one thing. You make mistakes all the time. You do dumb things, you recover from, you change, you pivot. But the question I think a community has to ask itself is, what is it you want to be? Are you trying to be the next name, Atlanta, New York, or something like that? Is that what you're trying to be? Some huge city that's got all that comes with it, good and bad? That's it. Or what is your focus? I think St. Pete has always focused, maybe not always, but most of history, on quality of life. How are we going to make this a great place for people to live here and visit here? Oh, how do we do that? And that does not necessarily mean you want to become the biggest in everything. It means that maybe you want to be the best, and maybe you want to be the greatest place to live, which is why we want to do arts and culture, which has become really in the last 20 years a passion of our city, and all that goes with it, and events. And you also want the city to be proud of itself. I believe that pride in your city is one of the reasons I am very passionate about branding St. Petersburg, is because I believe pride in your city is one of the greatest components of quality of life. And I think one of the greatest things I've seen in the last 25 years in our city is that the people who live here are very proud of our city. I think it's the best that there is. I'm sure there's lots of things I can list off that we should have done, but I think we're in great shape.
Final question.
Isla Urban. I grew up in Tampa. We moved there at 46, moved to St. Pete at 62. Happy about both choices. My question to both of you are, historically speaking, can you remind us of, or elaborate on what took place that an inland seen any real commercial shipping whatsoever. And what do you see going forward?
I can answer from St. Pete's perspective. It was a major battle during the first two decades of the 20th century as to whether we should have a working waterfront port city or whether we should have a waterfront park city. And I think Pam was referring to William Straub, who was the publisher of the Times at the time. And he was one of the leaders of the chamber. Was a big, they called it the Board of Trade at the time. Massive leaders. Actually, the Board of Trade, the Chamber of Commerce, actually got options and purchased a lot of those waterfront lots while they were trying to change the composition of City Council in order to get City Council in support of making those waterfront lots and into parks, for council to buy it and then make it into parks. And so I think it was a very deliberate decision on the part of the city at that time to go into the direction, as part of the City Beautiful movement, and to go in the direction of wanting to have this beautiful waterfront park system. And then kind of reserve Bayboro Harbor as the port, which became the port for the Coast Guard and port for other things. As far as if that's ever going to change, I don't see it in the near future changing. You have two issues, the biggest of which is the depth of the channel, and I don't think the Corps of Engineers is ever going to, in the near future, deepen that channel to any kind of port activity here, and I'm not sure the city would want to do that. So I don't see that as changing.
Just to add to that, I think the decision to create the Tampa port really set Tampa on the course of an industrial city. And then so much came from that. So, and the decision to create Fort Brooke and make that the first military outpost had a lot to do with Tampa then becoming a military outpost city, then an industrial port city, then the real city of commerce. Once you brought in the railroad, it really tied together to make Tampa this key business center. You could really say that the port has had much to do. I mean, you're absolutely on target to look at the port, because it had a lot to do with how we evolved as a business center. And even today, it's the 8th largest port in the country. It's a major port. It's a major economic engine for our entire community.
I think I'll add one thing to that.
Please.
And that's, I think, over the course of time, the decisions continue to evolve. And I think that, I think in St. Pete, we don't even understand ourselves what a center of commerce that we have become. But you have Franklin Templeton's East Coast headquarters. You have Jabil, which makes a lot of the Apple products. That's Fortune 200 company. General Dynamics headquarters, Fortune 100 company. You've got Raymond James with thousands of employees. So I think what has evolved is more of a, I would say, as far as business, financial, device manufacturing, military manufacturing, that kind of activity for the city. That's really been the biggest driver for our economy in the course of the last 30 years.
A round of applause.
Thank you, and I'd like to remind you that there's mugs.
That's what we
I think it was, you might have one or two by now. Thank you very much.
And chicken.
I want to remind everybody that the 19th, February 19th, is a night with Tigers, 6:30 at the Manhattan Theater, featuring our own Daniel Ruth, or the former Tampa, now Daniel Ruth. And